On a forgotten island ruled by an eternal moon, a cursed wolf king waits in endless agony, until a lost girl washes ashore, and their fated bond ignites a love strong enough to challenge a witch's wrath, shatter an ancient curse and rewrite destiny itself. Written by Luna Williams. The sea was a greedy god. It had swallowed the ship whole, splintering its proud masts and dragging its hull into the black churning depths. Evelyn remembered the screams, the chaos, the icy fist of the water closing over her head. She had fought, but it was a pointless struggle against an element that wanted only to consume. She was nothing. A scullery maid with no family name, no dowry, no future worth mentioning. Her death would be as insignificant as her life. But the sea had been fickle. It took everyone else. The captain, the sailors, the wealthy merchant and his sneering wife who'd looked at Evelyn as if she were dirt on her shoe, but it spat her out. She woke to the grating sound of sand against her skin. Cold gnawed at her bones, a deep, invasive chill that had settled into her marrow. Her lungs burned with the memory of salt water. She coughed, retching up a foul mixture of brine and bile that left her throat raw. For a long moment she lay there, a discarded thing on an unknown shore, her mind a hollowed-out cavern of shock. When she finally forced her eyes open, the world was a canvas of gray. A thick, pearlescent fog clung to everything, muffling sound and stealing color. It swirled around her ankles, a living, breathing entity that felt unervingly possessive. She pushed herself up, her limbs screaming in protest. A wave of dizziness crashed over her, and the shame came next, hot and immediate. She was naked. The sea had stripped her of her threadbare dress, her dignity, her last shred of identity. There was nothing left but shivering flesh and the raw humiliation of being so utterly exposed. She hugged herself, her own arms a pathetic shield against the cold and the unseen eyes she felt boring into her from the mist. The beach was a graveyard of obsidian-black sand and jagged rocks that looked like broken teeth. Gnarled, skeletal trees clawed at the edges of the fog, their branches twisted into agonizing shapes. There was no sign of the wreck, no debris, no other survivors. Only her. Alone. But she wasn't alone. He could feel it. The island itself seemed to watch her, its ancient, silent consciousness pressing in on all sides. The fog was not simple weather. It was a shroud, and within it, whispers slithered. They weren't words, not in any language she knew, but she understood them on a primal level. They curled around her name, tasting it, testing it. Evelyn. The sound was in her head, in the rustle of the coarse grass, in the slow, heavy drag of the waves. A shiver, entirely separate from the cold, traced its way down her spine. This place was haunted. Not by ghosts of men but by something older, wilder. She stumbled to her feet, her legs unsteady. She had to find shelter, clothes, anything to cover her shame. Her eyes scanned the oppressive grayness and she saw it. A break in the wall of trees, a path leading inland swallowed by shadows. It was a choice between the hungry sea at her back and the menacing unknown before her. She chose the unknown. Each step was an agony. The black sand was coarse and sharp, cutting into the soles of her feet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, pine and something else. Something musky and feral that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was the scent of a predator. She pushed through the grasping branches, their woody fingers scraping her skin, leaving thin red lines in their wake. The fog was even denser here, wrapping around her so tightly she felt she might suffocate. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of hunger, of waiting, of a long-held loneliness that mirrored the ache in her own chest. She had always been lonely, an orphan passed from one uncaring hand to another, but this was a different kind of solitude, the solitude of a king in an empty kingdom. She pressed on, driven by the desperate animal instinct to survive. The path opened into a clearing of sorts, dominated by the skeletal remains of what might have once been a castle. Crumbling stone walls, draped in ivy as black as the sand, rose like broken ribs from the earth. A single, jagged tower aimed a defiant finger at the perpetually overcast sky. It was a place of profound sorrow, a monument to a forgotten age. And it was there, in the heart of that desolate silence, that she heard it. It started low, a guttural vibration that resonated not in her ears, but in her bones. It built slowly, a current of sound that pushed the fog back, that made the very air tremble. It was a sound of pure, undiluted wildness, of savage power and a grief so deep it could crack the world in two. A howl. It tore through the silence, a blade of raw sound that sliced through Evelyn's terror and struck something dormant within her. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was no ordinary wolf. The sound was too big, too intelligent, too full of a pain that felt almost human. It wasn't a cry to a pack, it was a proclamation. A claim. The howl echoed off the ruined stones, and in the ringing silence that followed, Evelyn understood. The scent in the air, the whispers in the fog, the feeling of being watched, it all belonged to him. To the creature that had just announced its dominion. She was a trespasser in its kingdom. A shipwrecked mouse in a lion's den. But as the final notes of the howl faded, a strange and terrifying certainty settled over her. The sound hadn't just been a warning. It had been a welcome. It had reached inside her, touching a part of her soul she never knew existed and pulled. The island knew her. The wolf watched her. And in some terrible faded way she could not yet comprehend, she was already his. She was no longer Evelyn, the forgotten scullery maid. She was the one who had washed ashore. She was the one he had been waiting for. Fear should have sent her running back to the unforgiving sea. Logic, what little she had left, screamed at her to hide, to burrow into the earth and pray the beast would pass her by. But the howl had rewired something inside her. It had replaced terror with a fatalistic curiosity, a pull as undeniable as the tide. She was a moth, and that sound had been a flame in the suffocating darkness. She moved toward the ruins, her bare feet silent on the damp moss that carpeted the stones. The fog parted for her, as if granting her passage into the heart of the mystery. Through the crumbling archway of a long-dead great hall she saw them. 2 points of light, glowing with the intensity of molten silver. They were eyes, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving, intelligent focus. They were not the eyes of a simple animal. They held a weight of centuries, a burden of command, and a feral hunger that was aimed directly at her soul. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, the creature attached to those eyes stepped from the shadows of the ruined throne room. The word, wolf, was an insult to the being that stood before her. He was a beast of impossible size and terrible beauty, a creature torn from myth. His fur was the color of a storm cloud at midnight, thick and deep, with flecks of silver that seemed to capture and hold the dim light. Muscles coiled beneath his pelt with the promise of lethal, explosive power. He was bigger than any wolf she had ever seen in books, his shoulders as high as her waist, his head massive, his jaw capable of snapping bone as if it were a twig. He stood perfectly still, his silver eyes tracking her every tremble, every hitched breath. He was the apex predator, the king of this desolate land, and she was the most fragile thing to have ever trespassed in his domain. Yet he made no move to attack. There was no growl rumbling in his chest, no bared teeth. There was only watchfulness. An intensity so profound it felt like a physical touch. Evelyn took a hesitant step forward, then another. He didn't know why. Some part of her, the part that had resonated with his howl, urged her on. He did not move, but his head lowered slightly, his gaze unwavering. He was guarding this place. And now he was guarding her. Days blurred into a strange, timeless rhythm. The sky never changed. A single luminous moon, impossibly large and pure white, hung perpetually in the center of the sky, a silent, unblinking god. There was no sun, no dawn, no dusk. Only the eternal, silver-lit twilight and the wolf who was her constant shadow. He was never far. When she explored the crumbling castle, searching for anything useful, his presence was a warm weight at the edge of her awareness. When she found a spring of fresh, cold water, he was there, watching from a nearby ridge, his silver eyes a constant reassurance. He brought her food, a rabbit, a fish from a stream she hadn't seen, leaving them a respectful distance from the small, sheltered alcove she had claimed as her own. He guarded her with a silent, animal fury, but never once did he show her aggression. He was her jailer and her protector, the source of her fear and her only comfort. The shame of her nakedness remained a constant, burning humiliation. She tried to fashion a covering from large leaves and vines, a pathetic attempt at modesty that did little to ward off the chill or the feeling of his possessive gaze on her skin. She felt stripped bare not just of clothes but of her very self. She was no one. Just a foundling, a stray creature he had decided to keep. At night, sleep offered no escape. It was in her dreams that the island truly spoke to her. The whispers from the fog coalesced into a single voice, a man's voice. It was deep, rough with disuse, yet impossibly gentle. It wrapped around her in the darkness, a velvet caress against her fractured mind. Moonheart, the voice would murmur, the word a brand of heat against her soul. My Moonheart. In the dreams she wasn't cold or afraid. She was cherished. The voice spoke of centuries of waiting, of a curse forged in heartbreak, of a loneliness so vast it had nearly extinguished his soul. It spoke of her, of the scent of her skin on the sea breeze, a promise he had almost given up on. One night the dream was more vivid than ever. She felt the phantom touch of a large, calloused hand cupping her cheek. She felt the warmth of a massive body curled protectively around hers. She heard the deep, steady beat of a heart that was not her own. You are mine, the voice rumbled, not as a threat, but as a statement of irrefutable fact. You are always mine. Evelyn woke with a gasp, her body drenched in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the island's chill. A strange, unfamiliar heat coiled low in her belly, a confusing, shameful warmth that made her blush in the dim light. The alcove was empty. He was gone for the moment. Her heart was pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The dream had felt too real. The emotions it had stirred, a terrifying mix of fear and a desperate, aching longing, were too strong. She looked down at her hands, trying to ground herself, and saw it. On her left wrist, delicate and precise, were 4 faint red lines. They were not deep, not scratches born of violence. They were impressions, the ghost of a touch, perfectly spaced like the tips of claws that had gently, possessively held her while she slept. The truth crashed down on her with the force of a tidal wave. Wolf. The voice in her dreams. They were one and the same. The beast that guarded her by day became the man who claimed her in her sleep. Shame and heat twisted together inside her, a sickening, exhilarating knot. He had touched her. The beast had held her, marked her as his. She brought her wrist to her lips, the skin still tingling from the phantom pressure. Humiliation warred with a dark, thrilling curiosity. She was nothing, a castaway, and she was being courted by a monster. A monster whose touch, even in memory, felt more real and more wanted than any human hand had ever been. The claw marks on her wrist were a secret language she now desperately needed to understand. The beast, the man in her dreams, they were 2 halves of a cursed whole, and she was inexplicably at the center of their tragedy. The island was no longer just a prison. It was a puzzle, and her survival, perhaps even her sanity, depended on solving it. Driven by this new urgency, Evelyn began to search the ruins with a focused intensity she hadn't possessed before. She was no longer just looking for shelter or scraps of cloth. She was hunting for answers. The wolf watched her, his silver gaze more penetrating than ever, as if he knew her quest had changed. He seemed to follow her with a kind of mournful patience, a silent king observing the exploration of his own tomb. She ventured deeper into the castle's carcass, into halls where the roof had long since collapsed, allowing the perpetual twilight to illuminate the decay. She ran her hands over stones slick with moss, searching for anything that was not just nature reclaiming its own. In the heart of the keep, behind a curtain of thick black ivy that she had to tear away with her bare hands, she found it. A chamber miraculously preserved. The walls were not bare stone but a vast, seamless canvas of murals, their colors muted by time but their story still achingly clear. Evelyn stepped inside, her breath misting in the cold air. The chamber was circular, and the story unfolded around her in a devastating panorama. It began with a prince. He was depicted as tall and proud, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes that held the same silver fire as the wolf's. He was an alpha, the art made that clear. He stood surrounded by his pack, his authority absolute, his power undeniable. The next panel showed the arrival of a woman. She was beautiful, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of emeralds, but there was a darkness clinging to her, a hint of magic in the cruel twist of her smile. The mural showed her offering the prince a goblet, her expression possessive and demanding. He was a witch. Evelyn followed the story with her fingertips, tracing the lines of faded paint. The prince turned away from the witch. He did not drink. In his place, another woman stood beside him, her features softer, her smile gentle. Evelyn's heart stuttered. The woman in the mural, She had Evelyn's own dark, wavy hair, her heart-shaped face. It was a face she knew from her own faint reflection in the spring water. An ancestor? Or something more? The witch's fury was a storm on the wall. The next scene was pure chaos. Green flames, twisted shadows, the prince's pack scattered in terror. The witch stood at the center, her face a mask of vengeful rage, her hands raised as she unleashed a torrent of dark magic upon the prince who had rejected her love. The final, most heartbreaking panel stretched across the entire far wall. It depicted the prince, caught mid-transformation. His body was contorted in agony, his human form dissolving into the monstrous, beautiful shape of the great black wolf. His silver eyes, even in the painting, were filled with a torment so profound it felt fresh, as if the paint itself were still weeping. Below the image, etched into the stone with desperate clawed markings, was a name. Rylan Varec. The name slammed into her mind with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a name she read, it was a name she knew. It was the voice in her dreams, the unspoken identity behind the silver eyes. It was the soul trapped within the beast. Rylan. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The loneliness she'd felt from him, the deep ancient grief in his howl, it all made sense. He was a prince, a man, cursed to this bestial form for centuries, trapped on this island under a moon that never set, a constant reminder of the magic that held him prisoner. And the witch's rage, it still felt present, a poison that had seeped into the very stones of the island, a bitter, jealous energy that hated any intrusion. He had been cursed for spurning one woman's love for another's. For a woman who looked just like Evelyn. The weight of it was crushing. Was she a descendant? A cruel twist of fate? A random girl who bore a striking resemblance to the woman he had lost? Or was it something more? The way the island had whispered her name, the way the wolf had known her instantly, it felt like destiny, like a story left unfinished. Without thinking, her lips formed the name. She spoke it aloud, her voice a fragile tremor in the tomb-like silence of the chamber. Rylan. The moment the name left her lips, the world outside the chamber shifted. A low groan echoed through the stones of the castle, a sound of immense pressure releasing. Evelyn rushed to the chamber's entrance and looked out. The sky, which had been a constant, unchanging canvas of pearlescent gray, was transforming. A strange, ethereal light began to bleed from the eternal moon. Veins of liquid silver spread across the clouds, pulsing with a soft, inner luminescence. The air grew heavy, charged with a power that was both terrifying and beautiful. The island was responding to the name, to the acknowledgement of its lost prince. From the woods below the castle, a new sound rose, not a howl of loneliness, but a roar of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of Rylan, the sound of the curse fighting back, enraged that its secret had been spoken. It was the sound of a man remembering his own name on the lips of a woman he thought he'd lost forever. The sky bled silver, the ground trembled, and Rylan roared his pain to the heavens. Evelyn stood frozen, the name a burning coal on her tongue. She had not found answers, she had found the heart of the curse. And by speaking his name she had just challenged it. The witch's fury, dormant for centuries, was stirring. And Evelyn, a naked, helpless girl on a forgotten shore, had just declared herself its enemy. The silver sky was a bad omen. The witch's lingering magic, disturbed from its centuries-long slumber, began to seep from the poisoned earth like a foul vapor. Evelyn could feel the change in the air. The gentle, melancholic whispers of the fog were gone, replaced by a hissing, spiteful energy that crawled over her skin and promised pain. She backed away from the entrance to the mural chamber, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had woken something terrible. By giving the beast his name, she had reminded the curse of its purpose and of its hate. From the swirling mists around the castle courtyard they began to form. At first they were just darker patches of gray, condensations of shadow and malice. Then they took on vaguely human shapes, tall, thin, with hollows where their eyes should be and long, grasping fingers made of smoke. They were spirit wraiths, the echoes of the witch's rage, given form and a singular, malevolent purpose: to eradicate the intruder. To destroy the face that reminded the curse of its failure. They drifted toward her, their movements silent and unnatural. A cold deeper than the island's chill radiated from them, a deathly cold that promised to leach the life from her bones. Evelyn screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was swallowed by the oppressive fog. She scrambled backward, tripping over a loose stone and falling hard onto the unforgiving floor. There was nowhere to run. The wraiths converged, their smoky tendrils reaching for her, the air crackling with their dark energy. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the icy touch that she knew would mean the end. A blur of midnight fur and silver fury exploded into the courtyard. Rylan was a living storm. He tore through the wraiths not as an animal fighting a threat, but as a king dispensing wrath upon traitors. A guttural roar ripped from his chest, a sound of pure protective rage that shook the very foundations of the ruins. He moved with impossible speed, a black thunderbolt dealing death. He didn't just bite or claw. He shredded them. His jaws snapped shut on the smoky forms, and they dissipated with a sound like tearing silk. His claws, like silver razors, ripped through their ethereal bodies, leaving trails of fading light. He was magnificent and terrifying, a god of war defending his most sacred ground. He placed his massive body between Evelyn and the encroaching spirits, a living shield of muscle and fur. One of the larger wraiths managed to slip past his guard, its smoky hand reaching for Evelyn's face. Before it could touch her, Rylan lunged, seizing it in his mouth and shaking his head with a violence that ripped the spirit to shreds. As its form disintegrated, a fine mist of its essence settled over Evelyn, and with it came his scent. It coated her skin, sank into her pores, a primal mark of ownership that was staggering in its intensity. It was the scent of the island itself, wild, untamed pine needles crushed underfoot, the clean, sharp smell of a thunderstorm breaking over the sea, and beneath it all the musky, dominant scent of the Alpha himself. It was intoxicating. It was a claim. In that moment he had marked her as his territory, a treasure to be protected at all costs. When the last wraith was gone, torn to nothingness by his fury, a heavy silence descended. Rylan stood over her, his broad chest heaving, his silver eyes blazing with the aftermath of battle. He was breathing hard, the scent of him rolling off his body in waves, enveloping her completely. Evelyn's terror gave way to a primal awe. He had saved her. This monster, this cursed prince, had just fought the shadows of hell for her. Her survival instinct, however, finally kicked back in. This was too much. The magic, the wraiths, the sheer, overwhelming power of the beast before her. It was a world she didn't belong in. She had to get away. Scrambling to her feet, she turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to put distance between herself and the beautiful, terrifying creature that had just branded her with his scent. She fled through the ruins, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone, her lungs burning. He followed. It was not the chase of a predator hunting its prey. There was no sound, no heavy panting, no thud of paws. He moved like a shadow, a silent, relentless presence at her back. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight. When she risked a glance over her shoulder, he was there, pacing her effortlessly, his head low, his silver eyes filled with a sorrowful understanding that shattered her resolve. He wasn't chasing her, he was escorting her. He was allowing her the illusion of escape while refusing to let her go. Exhaustion finally claimed her. Her legs gave out and she collapsed in a heap on a patch of damp moss at the edge of the forest. Sobs tore from her throat. Sobs of fear, of confusion, of a strange, burgeoning affection for her monstrous guardian. She was trapped. She heard him approach, the soft patting of his paws on the earth. She curled into a ball, hiding her face, waiting for the end. But the killing bite never came. Instead she felt a shift in the air, a profound change in his posture. Risking a look through her tear-damp lashes, she saw him. He was not looming over her, a predator over its quarry. He was bowing. The great alpha wolf, the cursed prince of Lycanthra, had lowered his massive head to her in a gesture of profound submission, of reverence. His forehead nearly touched the ground, his magnificent body curved in a display of utter devotion. As he held the bow, the eternal moon above them seemed to pulse with light. It grew brighter, more intense, its silver luminescence pouring down like a physical substance, bathing them both in its glow. A low hum started, a vibration that came from the island itself, from the stones and the soil and the ancient trees. It was a sound of approval, a sound of recognition. In that moment, a bond, fragile and new, snapped into place between them. It was a pull in her soul, a tether that connected her to the grieving beast before her. It was a language she couldn't speak but understood perfectly. He was hers and she was his. The island, the moon, and fate itself had just sealed their pact. The run had been a fever-breaking. In its aftermath, a strange calm settled over Evelyn. Her terror had burned away, leaving behind a raw, trembling acceptance. She could not escape this island. She could not escape him. Rylan, the name was a constant whisper in her mind, was her reality now. Her protector, her captor, her curse, and her only companion. She stopped running from him. A new, unspoken accord grew between them in the perpetual silver twilight. She would no longer flee, and he in turn maintained a respectful, watchful distance. But the space between them was charged, filled with a tension that was both frightening and achingly sweet. She began to speak to him. Not with words he could understand in his current form, but with the quiet murmurings of a lonely heart. As she foraged for berries, he had shown her a patch of them, nudging a bush with his nose. She would tell him about her life before the shipwreck. A life of insignificance, of being overlooked, of a gnawing hunger for a home she never had. She spoke of her shame, of the humiliation of being so exposed and helpless. He would sit nearby, his great head resting on his paws, his silver eyes fixed on her. He listened. She knew he did. He couldn't answer, but she could feel his attention, his empathy, a vast and silent sympathy that soothed the ragged edges of her soul. No one had ever listened to her before. She had been invisible. Here in this lost kingdom, under the gaze of a cursed beast, she was the center of an entire world. His care for her was meticulous, instinctual, and deeply touching. He led her to the warmest caves when the air grew colder. He brought her the choicest pieces of his hunts, leaving them where she would find them. When a sharp rock cut her foot, he appeared moments later, nudging a plant with broad, soothing leaves toward her with his snout. She crushed them as if by instinct and applied the pulp to the wound. The pain eased almost instantly. He knew the island's secrets and he shared them with her. But for all his bestial grace and power, she felt the man inside him more and more acutely. She saw him in the flicker of profound intelligence in his eyes, in the controlled restraint of his powerful muscles. She felt him in the deep, shuddering sighs that would escape him when he thought she was asleep, sighs full of a frustration so deep it was a physical agony. He was a prisoner in his own skin, a king reduced to communicating with nudges and mournful gazes. The human inside was screaming to be free, begging to close the distance between them, begging for a touch he had been denied for centuries. And Evelyn began to feel an echo of that hunger in her own blood. She watched the elegant ripple of his muscles as he walked, the sheer untamed beauty of him. She remembered the dream of his voice calling her moon heart, the phantom weight of his body curled around hers. The scent of pine and storm that clung to her was a constant reminder of his claim, a brand that stirred a strange and forbidden heat within her. The desire to touch him became an obsession, a knot of want and fear in her chest. To bridge that final gap between them, to offer a comfort she wasn't sure he could even accept. What would he do? Would the beast recoil? Would the man inside rejoice? One evening she sat near the entrance of their shared cave, watching as the silver light of the eternal moon painted the fog-draped landscape. Rylan lay a few yards away, a silent, dark sentinel. His gaze was distant, lost in a past she could only glimpse from the murals. The loneliness radiating from him was a palpable thing, a cloak of sorrow so heavy she felt she might suffocate under its weight. She could bear it no longer. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of terror and resolve. Slowly she rose to her feet. He didn't move, but his ears swiveled, tracking the whisper-soft sound of her bare feet on the stone. His silver eyes shifted, locking onto hers. They were wide, questioning, vulnerable. She took one step, then another, closing the space between them. Each footfall was a lifetime. The air grew thick, electric with unspoken emotion. She stopped just before him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his massive body, close enough to see the intricate silver flecks in his dark fur. He held himself perfectly still, a statue carved from midnight and moonlight. He was giving her the choice. He would not move, would not startle her. He was surrendering his power to her, the fragile human he had sworn to protect. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. It felt impossibly small, pale and weak against the backdrop of his immense, wild power. Fear warred with a desperate need to connect, to soothe the ancient ache she saw in his eyes. Drawing a shaky breath, she reached out and laid her palm flat against the thick fur of his shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. A violent shudder racked his entire body, a tremor that started deep in his core and shook him from nose to tail. It wasn't a growl of aggression or a flinch of fear. It was the shudder of a man waking from centuries of hunger, of a soul starved of contact finally receiving a drop of water in an endless desert. A low, strangled sound escaped his throat, a sound that was half whine, half groan, a sound of exquisite relief and unbearable pain. He leaned into her touch, a barely perceptible movement, his eyes closing as if in reverence. Her fingers sank into his deep, soft fur, and beneath it she felt the bunched, powerful muscles, the heat of his skin, the frantic, thundering beat of his heart. In that moment he was not a beast and she was not his captive. They were two lonely souls, touching for the first time across an abyss of magic and time. Evelyn felt a tear slip down her cheek, a tear for his pain, for his loneliness, and for the terrifying, beautiful bond that was growing between them. Her touch was not just a comfort. It was a key, and she had just turned it in a lock she didn't understand, unleashing a flood of desperate, dangerous hope. The touch had broken a dam. Now a tentative, fragile intimacy flowed between them. Evelyn no longer hesitated to brush her hand against his flank as she passed, or to rest her head against his warm, solid bulk while she slept. And Rylan in turn no longer kept his distance. He would lay his great head in her lap, his silver eyes closing in blissful contentment as her fingers stroked through the fur behind his ears. He was still a wolf, but the desperate man within him was closer to the surface than ever, soaking in her affection like a dying man soaking in the sun. The island itself seemed to hold its breath, watching them. The eternal moon cast a softer, more hopeful glow, and the fog seemed to recede just enough to let them exist in their small bubble of shared solitude. But the witch's curse was a jealous warden, and it would not tolerate such tenderness for long. A storm rolled in from the Black Sea, a tempest of unnatural violence. Wind howled through the ruins with a banshee's shriek, and rain fell in cold, stinging sheets. It was the curse lashing out, trying to tear them apart, to remind Rylan of his isolation. He herded Evelyn deep into the most sheltered part of their cave, his body a formidable barrier against the raging elements. Huddled in the darkness, with the storm's fury echoing around them, Evelyn drifted into an exhausted sleep. This time the dream was different. It wasn't just a voice and a phantom touch. This time she saw him. He stood before her, finally free of the beast. He was human. And he was devastating. Taller than she could have imagined, with a warrior's build, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped. His hair was as black as his wolf's pelt, falling in unruly waves around a face that was all sharp angles and stark beauty. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, a testament to a life of battle before his curse. But it was his eyes that held her captive, the same molten silver eyes, now filled with an intelligence, a pain and a fierce, possessive adoration that made her knees weak. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice was the same deep, rough caress from her dreams. Hearing it while looking at his face was an entirely new kind of intimacy. "By Moonheart, you came back to me." In the dream she wasn't afraid. She stepped forward, her hand rising to touch the scar above his eye. "Rylan." His name on her lips was a key. His expression shattered, the carefully controlled mask of the Alpha Prince crumbling to reveal the centuries of agony beneath. He reached for her, his large hands framing her face with a reverence that felt like worship. "I have waited so long," he rasped, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "To see you. To touch you like this." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of pine and storm was overwhelming, purely masculine, completely him. He was about to kiss her. She could feel the heat of his breath, the desperate longing rolling off him in waves, when the dream began to fracture. The image of him wavered, and a guttural cry of agony tore from his throat. Evelyn woke with a violent jolt. The storm still raged outside, but a new, more terrible sound filled the cave. A sound of tearing flesh and snapping bone. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom and she gasped. Rylan was beside her, writhing on the stone floor. He was no longer fully wolf. The curse, weakened by the depth of their growing bond and her presence, was failing. But it was not letting go without a fight. He was caught in a horrifying, twisted state of half-transformation. One arm was human, corded with muscle and ending in a man's hand, its fingers clenched in agony. The other limb was still the thick furred leg of the wolf. His torso was a grotesque mixture of both skin and fur warring for dominance. His face was the worst. One half was the noble scarred prince from her dream, the other was the snarling muzzle of the beast, his jaw locked in a silent scream. But his eyes, both eyes were human. They were silver wide with excruciating pain and they were fixed on her. They were pleading. Pleading for her to run, pleading for her to help, pleading for an end to his torment. Tears streamed down her face. She crawled toward him, ignoring the danger, ignoring the horrifying sight of his body tearing itself apart. "Rylan," she whispered, her voice breaking. He managed to sound a choked groan. He reached for her with his human hand, his fingers trembling. He wanted to touch her, but he was afraid his monstrous form would harm her. It was in that moment Evelyn understood. Their bond was a weapon against the curse, but it wasn't strong enough. It needed to be sealed, to be forged in a way the witch's magic could not break. It required a choice. A total and absolute surrender. He seemed to understand her decision in the same instant. A deep, guttural sound rumbled in his chest as he dragged his tortured body closer. This was not a choice he could make. It had to be hers. He lowered his head, the wolfish side of his face pressing against her shoulder. She felt the heat of his breath, the wetness of his nose, and then the sharp pressure of his fangs against her skin. He hesitated, his entire body trembling with the effort of control. A single tear, hot and human, fell from his eye and onto her arm. He was giving her a final chance to pull away. She did not. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the fur and skin of his warring forms. "Do it," she breathed, the words a vow. With a sound that was both a sob and a roar, he bit down. The pain was a flash of white-hot fire, sharp and breathtaking. His fangs pierced the flesh of her shoulder, a definitive, irrevocable claim. A scream tore from her throat, but it was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of release, of catharsis, of finality. As the pain subsided into a throbbing, burning ache, a wave of pure, undiluted energy surged through her. It was him. His strength, his spirit, his essence, pouring into her, marking her soul as surely as his teeth had marked her skin. The scream softened, changing tone, becoming a vow of belonging that echoed in the storm-swept cave. She was his. In that moment of shared agony and ecstasy, she had chosen her fate. The bond, once a fragile thread, was now an unbreakable chain. And outside, the storm raged as if the curse itself was screaming in fury at its defeat. The claiming bite was an anchor in the storm. The agonizing transformation receded, Rylan's body collapsing back into the full, familiar form of the wolf. He lay panting on the cave floor, his sides heaving, his silver eyes clouded with exhaustion and a new, deeper adoration as he gazed at her. The bond between them was no longer a gentle pull. It was a roaring river, a current of shared thought and emotion that flowed constantly between them. Evelyn could feel his weariness, his relief, and his overwhelming love for her as if they were her own. She touched the fresh mark on her shoulder, the skin tender and throbbing, and felt not pain, but a profound sense of rightness. She belonged to him. But such a blatant act of rebellion against an ancient curse could not go unanswered. As the storm outside began to subside, a new disturbance took its place. The sea, which had been crashing against the shore with mindless fury, grew unnaturally calm. A thick oily fog, blacker than the island's usual mist, rolled in from the water, carrying with it the stench of stagnant brine and bitter magic. Rylan sensed it first. A low, warning growl rumbled in his chest, a sound far more menacing than any she had heard from him before. He rose to his feet, every muscle in his body tensed, and placed himself squarely in front of Evelyn, a living shield of fur and fury. His hackles were raised, and his lips drew back from his teeth in a silent, lethal snarl. Evelyn peered past his protective form, her heart seizing with a cold, primal dread. From the black waves a figure was rising. Water cascaded from a form cloaked in seaweed and shadow, coalescing into the shape of a woman. She was ethereally beautiful and utterly terrifying. Her hair, the color of spun gold, was tangled with kelp and shells. Her eyes glowed with a malevolent emerald light. Her skin was unnaturally pale, and her magic dripped from her fingertips like black viscous tar. It was the witch from the murals. She had come. So, the witch's voice slithered across the shore, dripping with centuries of venom. The little stray has a name. And a bite. How quaint. She glided toward them, her feet not touching the sand, floating on a cushion of dark magic. The very air around her seemed to curdle and decay. You have his scent all over you, little thing, she hissed, her emerald eyes fixing on Evelyn with an ancient, obsessive hatred. An intruder. Thief. Come to steal what is mine just as you did before. Evelyn recoiled. I don't know what you're talking about. The witch, Seraphine, let out a laugh that sounded like grinding glass. Oh, you don't remember? The soul is the same even if the mind is new. The same weak, pathetic soul that turned his head all those centuries ago. He was mine for the taking, the most powerful alpha this land had ever seen. I offered him immortality, power beyond his dreams. And he threw it all away, for you. Her gaze flickered to Rylan, who stood unmoving, a statue of controlled rage. You see, my prince, she crooned. Destiny has a cruel sense of humor. It sends you the same face, the same soul to torment you all over again. A pale imitation of a love you can never have. The revelation struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just a look-alike. She was her reborn. The woman from the mural. Fate had not just shipwrecked her here by chance. It had delivered her, an echo of the past, back to the heart of the curse. All of Rylan's immediate recognition, the island's welcome, the feeling of coming home, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Love was now rebellion. Her very existence was a defiance of Seraphine's power. Leave her alone, Rylan's voice boomed, not from his wolf's mouth but in Evelyn's mind, a telepathic roar transmitted through their new bond. It was raw, powerful, and laced with killing intent. Seraphine smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. You think your little bond can challenge me? It only makes this more delicious. Your love is the key to your suffering, Rylan. The more you care for her, the more my curse will delight in tearing you apart. As if to prove her point, she lifted a hand and a tendril of black magic shot out, striking Rylan. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. Rylan roared in agony, his body convulsing violently. The painful half-transformation began again, but this time it was 100 times worse, accelerated by Seraphine's malevolent will. His bones cracked and reshaped, his body twisting and contorting as the man and wolf fought a brutal internal war. He collapsed to the ground, his form flickering between human and beast, caught in a purgatory of unimaginable pain. Rylan! Evelyn screamed, moving to go to him, but the witch flicked her wrist, and an invisible barrier slammed Evelyn back against the cave wall. Every moment you are near him, every loving thought you have will fuel his torment, Seraphine spat, her eyes burning with triumph. He will tear himself to pieces trying to reach you, trying to be the man you want. Your love is his poison. The only way to save him is to leave. Or to die. Evelyn watched, helpless, as Rylan writhed, his pained howls mixing with the witch's cruel laughter. The bond that had felt so right, so powerful, was now a conduit for his agony. She could feel every shred of his pain, every muscle that tore, every bone that broke and reformed. Her love was destroying him. The greatest act of rebellion had become the ultimate weapon of the curse. The witch's laughter was the cruelest sound Evelyn had ever heard. It echoed the agony that was pouring through the bond from Rylan, a symphony of suffering conducted by Seraphine's bitter magic. He was trapped, a writhing knot of man and beast, his body a battlefield where her love and the witch's hate waged war. You see, little soul? Seraphine gloated, her emerald eyes alight with madness. This is the only power your love has here. The power to destroy him. Evelyn's mind raced, a desperate scramble for a way out, for a weapon, for any hope at all. Her gaze flickered past the witch, past the tormented form of her mate and up to the sky. The eternal moon. It hung there, a silent, powerful observer, its silver light the source of this island's strange magic. It was older than the curse, older than the witch. It was the original power. There is a way to break it, Evelyn said, her voice shaking but firm. She was guessing, praying. There has to be. Seraphine's smile widened. Oh, there is. But the price is one you could never pay. The moon is a goddess of balance. My curse was born of a broken heart. To undo it, another heart must be offered in its place. A willing sacrifice of true love. To break his curse you must offer your heart, literally. The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. A blood sacrifice. The ancient altar at the island's peak, Seraphine continued, savoring every word. The one where the first alphas pledged their loyalty to the moon. Kneel before it, offer your life, and the magic will be undone. Your blood for his freedom. A perfect, tragic bargain. She believed Evelyn would never do it. She saw her as the weak human thing she was, fragile, afraid, selfish. But Seraphine did not understand. Evelyn's life before this island had been nothing. A gray, meaningless existence. Here she had found a purpose. She had been seen, protected, claimed. She had found love in the eyes of a monster and a prince. A life without him, even a long one, would be a return to that gray nothingness. His freedom was worth more than her empty future. No, Evelyn. Rylan's voice roared in her mind, a blast of pure terror and denial. He was fighting the pain, fighting to get to his feet. Just run. I forbid it. I would rather suffer this for 1,000 more years than lose you. Asterisk. His desperation, his willingness to endure this agony for her, only solidified her resolve. Destiny had brought her here not to repeat the past but to end it. Mercy is not for destiny to grant, Evelyn whispered, her eyes meeting Seraphine's. Ignoring the witch, ignoring the invisible barrier, she turned and began to walk. The path to the island's peak was one she had never taken, yet her feet knew the way. The island itself seemed to guide her, the fog parting, the ancient stones forming a natural staircase up the cliffs. Seraphine did nothing to stop her, a look of shocked, delighted disbelief on her face. This was a better victory than she could have imagined. She would not only be rid of her rival, but she would have forced her to commit the ultimate act of self-destruction. Evelyn, and Rylan's mental scream was a physical blow, staggering her. He was fighting with every ounce of his being, his mangled body trying to crawl after her. Please, Moonheart, don't leave me. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not stop. I love you, Rylan Varec, she sent back to him through the bond, a message of pure, undiluted devotion. I was nothing until you. Let me be your everything now. The climb was steep and treacherous, but she felt no fear. The peak was a flattened, windswept plateau, and at its center stood a single massive slab of obsidian black stone, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. It was the altar. It hummed with a quiet, immense power, soaking in the silver light of the moon above. She walked to it, her movements calm and deliberate. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the altar, the moon, and the bond connecting her to the soul of the man she loved. She could feel his frantic, desperate struggle below, his spirit clawing its way up the mountain after her. She knelt. The moment her knees touched the cold ground before the altar, the moon's light intensified, focusing on her in a single brilliant column. The air grew still. All sound ceased. And then Rylan's roar shattered the heavens. He had finally forced his body into its full wolf form, shaking off the witch's direct assault through sheer, indomitable will. The sound that ripped from his throat was not of a beast, but of a god in mourning. It was a sound of absolute loss, of a soul being torn in two. It shook the mountains, sent cracks spider-webbing across the altar, and pushed back the sea itself. It was the sound of the world ending. From the base of the mountain, Seraphine's laughter split the air, a sharp, triumphant crack against the deep bass of Rylan's grief. She had won. Evelyn closed her eyes. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling its steady, final beats. She thought of Rylan's silver eyes, his scent of pine and storm, his touch. She had no knife, no weapon. But she knew none was needed. The moon did not need blood spilled by steel. It needed it to be given. For him, she whispered to the silent, watching moon. Take it. The bargain was accepted. Evelyn felt a strange, painless pressure in her chest, a gentle but irresistible pull from the moon above. The light intensified, turning from silver to a blinding, pure white. She saw Rylan then, a blur of black fur, streaking up the mountain path, his speed inhuman, his desperation a physical force that battered against her senses through the bond. He would be too late. A warmth spread through her torso and she looked down. A soft, silver flame, no bigger than her palm, was glowing through the skin over her heart. It wasn't burning her, it was her. It was her life force, her soul, being drawn out by the moon's ancient magic. The light grew, pulsing in time with her fading heartbeat. He reached the plateau just as her strength gave out. He skidded to a halt, his massive form trembling, his silver eyes wide with a horror that transcended man or beast. Evelyn smiled, a faint, tired curve of her lips. She reached a hand out to him, a final, silent plea for him to understand. He surged forward, closing the distance in a single bound, catching her as her body slumped backward. She died in his arms. Her last sensation was the feeling of his thick, soft fur against her cheek, the scent of pine and storm filling her senses one last time. The silver flame in her chest pulsed brilliantly and then extinguished, taking her with it. But as her life fled, it did not simply vanish. It erupted from her body in a silent, explosive wave of pure, untainted magic. The wave of silver light washed over Rylan first. He threw back his head and roared, a sound of unendurable agony as the magic scoured him inside and out. It was not the pain of transformation but of purification. The witch's curse, ancient and powerful, dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. His bones snapped, his muscles tore and reformed one final time, not in a chaotic battle but in a swift, decisive realignment. The wolf was gone. Rylan Varec, the man, the Alpha Prince, knelt on the mountaintop, his body naked and new in the moonlight. Scars, old and new, crisscrossed a physique honed by centuries of feral survival. His black hair whipped around his face in the wind. He was free. But his freedom was ashes in his mouth. He looked down at the woman cradled in his arms. Her skin was pale, her body still and lifeless. Her eyes were closed and the gentle smile was frozen on her lips. His mate. His moon heart. The soul he had waited centuries for, found and lost in the space of a few impossible days. The curse was broken. The price was everything. A choked sob, the first human sound he had made in an age, tore from his throat. He clutched her body to his chest, his shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it was a physical storm. He who had not been able to shed a single tear as a wolf, now wept. The first tears of a king, hot and bitter, fell onto Evelyn's cold cheek. Down below at the base of the mountain, Seraphine screamed. The wave of silver light had struck her like a thunderbolt. Her magic was inextricably tied to the curse. It was the source of her immortality, the anchor of her power. As the curse unraveled, so did she. Her form flickered, her beauty melting away to reveal the withered ancient crone beneath. Her power turned on her, consuming her from the inside out. With a final hate-filled shriek that echoed across the island, she disintegrated into a cloud of black dust, which the wind greedily scattered over the sea. Defeated not by a hero's sword, but by the purity of a love she could never comprehend. As the last echo of her death cry faded, a monumental groan shook the heavens. The eternal moon, its bargain fulfilled, its long vigil over, began to move. For the first time in centuries, it started to fall toward the western horizon. The magic that had held Lycanthra in a timeless stasis was broken. As the moon descended, it painted the sky in impossible colors, streaks of violet, rose, and gold. It turned the surface of the sea to liquid light, a shimmering celestial mirror. It was the most beautiful sight the world had ever seen. But Rylan did not see it. He saw only the pale, still face of his love. He was a man again, a king without a queen, a soul with its other half ripped away. He held her lifeless body and wept as the dawn he had longed for centuries prepared to break over his ruined world. Time had restarted on Lycanthra. The setting of the eternal moon was a slow, majestic funeral procession, dragging the silver-lit twilight with it. Rylan did not move from the altar. He remained on his knees, cradling Evelyn's body, his grief a gravity well that bent the world around him. The cold was beginning to seep into his human skin, a trivial discomfort compared to the Arctic winter in his soul. He had won his freedom only to be imprisoned in a new, more terrible way, by memory and loss. He had whispered her name 1,000 times, his voice raw and broken. He had begged her to wake up, pleaded with any god that might be listening, but his prayers fell on the deaf ears of a dawn that was now inevitable. He pressed his face into her hair, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of her, trying to burn the memory into his being before it, too, faded. As the first sliver of the sun's gold crested the horizon, its unfamiliar light touched the altar. It was a warm, gentle light, so different from the moon's cold silver. When the first ray of dawn touched Evelyn's skin, something impossible happened. A soft, silver light began to glow from the bite mark on her shoulder. Rylan's head snapped up, his breath catching in his throat. The light spread, tracing glowing, silver veins across her skin, converging over her heart. It was the same light as her sacrifice, but this was not the light of death. It was the light of creation. The ashes of the curse, the remnants of Seraphine's power, and the pure magic of Evelyn's sacrifice were being reforged by the dawn's new magic. A gasp of air, sharp and sudden, shuddered through Evelyn's lungs. Her eyes flew open. But they were not the same eyes. The soft human brown was gone. Her irises now shone with the captured light of the eternal moon, a luminous, molten silver that mirrored his own. Power, ancient and absolute, radiated from her. She sat up, her movements fluid and graceful, her body shedding the stillness of death like a discarded cloak. The simple shroud of leaves and vines she had worn dissolved into motes of light, replaced by a gown that seemed woven from moonlight and fog, shimmering with a life of its own. Her hair, once a simple brown, now held streaks of pure silver that caught the morning light. She was no longer Evelyn, the human scullery maid. She was no longer mortal. Her sacrifice had not been an end but a transcendence. She had given her human heart to the moon, and in return the moon had given her its own. "Rylan," she said, and her voice was a melody of starlight and whispers, familiar and yet entirely new. It held the quiet authority of the tides and the ageless wisdom of the sky. He could only stare, his mind reeling, his heart, which he thought had shattered, now hammering with a wild, incredulous hope. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hesitating just before they touched her cheek, half afraid she was an illusion his grief had conjured. She leaned into his touch, her skin warm and vibrantly alive. "I am here," she whispered, her silver eyes shining with the same deep love he had seen in them before, now magnified 1,000 times. From the ashes of the curse, Evelyn had risen. She was the moon queen of Lycanthra, the island's new heart, crowned in silver fire by the first light of dawn. The truth of what she had become settled over Rylan, a wave of awe so profound it brought him to his knees. Not in grief this time but in worship. He, the Alpha King, the proud, cursed prince, lowered his head before her. He had been her protector, her guardian. Now she was his goddess. His love, once a fierce, possessive obsession, was purified, transformed into a devotion so complete it was a form of prayer. "My queen," he choked out, the words a vow of fealty that bound his soul to hers for all eternity. Evelyn smiled, a gesture of infinite tenderness. She placed her hand on his bowed head, her touch sending a current of pure, healing energy through him, soothing the centuries of pain and loneliness. "Rise, my king," she said. As he stood, the sun climbed higher, bathing the island in its golden glory. The oppressive fog that had shrouded Lycanthra for centuries, the physical manifestation of the curse, began to burn away. For the first time they saw their kingdom in the light of day. It was not a desolate ruin but a land of breathtaking beauty. Lush green forests, cliffs of shining granite, and beaches of sparkling black sand. A paradise held prisoner, now set free. The air was clean and fresh, filled with the scent of salt earth and blooming flowers. The dawn had come. Rylan looked from the transformed island to the incandescent woman before him. He was his mate, his queen, his salvation. He was the Alpha King returned from his beastly prison. Together they were the new dawn of Lycanthra. He pulled her into his arms, and this time when he kissed her, it was not in a fractured dream, but in the warm, real and glorious light of their new beginning.